The latest daily Treasury statement was released on Tuesday. It shows July's haul surpassing the previous record of 27 billion set in June. And reactions are coming in from around the world to President Trump's latest tariffs. Some, like Japan and Cambodia, welcomed the reduced rates. Others, like New Zealand and Taiwan, are pushing for lower figures. Here's Japan's chief cabinet secretary discussing the country's new tariff rate of 15%.
We believe that the recent executive action, based on a series of agreements, will help reduce uncertainty surrounding U.S. trade policy and lessen the risk that such policies could negatively affect the Japanese and global economies.
You're aware the United States has today announced a new tariff regime which increases tariffs on New Zealand goods entering the U.S. from 10 to 15%. This is a disappointing development.
So far, the negotiations have achieved some interim progress. The tax rate has been reduced from 32% to 20%. However, the 20% tariff rate was never Taiwan's target to begin with. We will continue negotiations and strive for a rate that's more favorable for Taiwan.
Norway and Switzerland also expressed disappointment with 15% and 39% tariffs, respectively, saying they will continue to try to negotiate. Australia, meanwhile, said an unchanged rate of 10% is a vindication of Prime Minister Albanese's calm diplomacy with the U.S. Australia joined Pakistan and Thailand in welcoming Trump's latest order as a positive step. And joining us now to discuss whether President Trump has the legal authority to impose tariffs is Gerard Filitti, senior counsel at the Lawfare Project. As an attorney, Gerard specializes in civil rights, national security law, and international law. Good afternoon, Gerard. So there was a hearing yesterday before a federal appeals court, and it seems like many of the judges were skeptical of Trump's use of reciprocal tariffs. To start off, would you mind walking us through perhaps some of the arguments?
Well, the argument on President Trump's part is that there is legislation, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEPA, that would give him the allowance to impose tariffs as a national security measure in an emergency, and that these trade deficits that the United States has been experiencing constitute that emergency that empower him to place tariffs. Now, the appellate court expressed skepticism about this, in part because the language of the legislation does not specifically mention tariffs, in part because it's hard to see a long-standing deficit as an urgent or a new emergency, and also in part because of recent Supreme Court rulings that major questions, especially ones that are so weighty on the economy, require clear congressional approval, clear congressional authorization, and this is not what IEPA entails. So there was a lot of skepticism that was raised on President Trump's use of this measure.
So there's a lot of points to go through, but one of them is, how do you know when there's an economic emergency? How do courts evaluate that, economically speaking? What do they consider?
There's no bright line for a court to evaluate that. It's on the circumstances, on the facts at issue before the court. And here we're not talking about a new problem. We're talking about a long-standing deficit that's been decades in the making. So this is why we have skepticism from the court. Now, IEPA also significantly doesn't mention tariffs. When this legislation was first passed, it was meant to give the president power to impose sanctions or to freeze assets in a national emergency when there is, for example, conflict with a foreign country. So what we're seeing now, the use of tariffs, which is a normal trade mechanism, President Trump is arguing that there is an emergency that requires its use, and the court doesn't have a bright line to follow. It's just using its common sense based on the facts at present.
So another point was that the judge said it's hard to see how Congress intended to give the president such broad tariff authority, right? So how is tariff authority actually split between Congress and the president?
Well, Congress, it is solely within the province of Congress to enact tariffs. That is delegated to Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. So in order for the president to have tariff authority, it would need to be delegated by Congress to him. And currently there is no specific legislation that does that. This is why President Trump used IEPA. That is the closest thing to regulating trade that the president can do under law that was delegated by Congress, authority that was delegated by Congress to the president.
So what do you make of the administration's comparison to the Trading with the Enemy Act?
The Trading with the Enemy Act is what IEPA replaced. The Trading with the Enemy Act did empower, a court did rule that that did include tariffs. This is why President Trump is saying that if you look at the law before IEPA, the law on which IEPA was modeled, that was ruled by a court to encompass tariffs, and therefore tariffs should be within his purview in this new legislation. However, because IEPA doesn't specifically mention tariffs, this is why there's been successful opposition so far to President Trump's use of this measure. It all comes down to a question of what authority specifically Congress gave to the president.
Do you think the absence of the word tariffs in IEPA weakens the administration's argument?
I think it does weaken the administration's argument, especially in light of more recent Supreme Court decisions from the last few years, which have as a pattern established that when Congress delegates authority, it needs to be explicit, especially when you have major questions, especially when you have issues of such national importance or such economic importance, that you can't rely on an interpretation that's vague. The delegation has to be clear. So I think this is why the court was carefully looking at the language of IEPA.
What do you say to the idea, and you mentioned this earlier, about trade deficits and how they've been, existing for a long time? How does that constitute as an emergency?
For them to constitute an emergency, President Trump would have to make an argument of what's changed or what's new, or basically to explain that trade deficits have reached such a high level that it is now an emergency compared to what the levels were a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that's a burden that he hasn't met yet. He hasn't explained why this is suddenly an emergency and it's not something that should be addressed in the normal course of congressional business.
Have you seen any signs of how this court might decide?
The way we heard the questioning, we are inclined to think that the court is not likely to side with President Trump. The court is likely to say that he exceeded congressional authority in engaging in these tariffs. However, this is something that we will see appealed, and this far from resolves the issue.
And then it's going to go to the Supreme Court potentially, right?
Potentially to the Supreme Court, and there are also other mechanisms that President Trump could use to try to justify tariffs. But at the end of the day, it's notable that he has been very successful so far in negotiating tariffs, and that many countries are looking at the Supreme Court and what it will ultimately decide, not at what the appeals court is questioning.
Okay, let's say hypothetically speaking, the Supreme Court takes on this case and upholds the block on President Trump's tariffs. What are the impacts? What are the implications? What happens after that?
The impact is that it would stop tariffs that are now in place that have not been negotiated with other countries. For countries that have reached a trade deal with the United States, that's irrelevant. A deal has been signed. But the threat of future tariffs would be taken off the table, and that would be a blow to President Trump's ability to improve the deficit by imposing these tariffs. He would have to go back to the drawing board and find a different law or a different mechanism to do so. Now, it's also likely that President Trump will work with Congress, which, let's not forget, is controlled still by the Republican Party, to give him legislation that allows him to enact tariffs. So that would be the logical step. Regardless of what the Supreme Court rules, it would be for Congress to draft authorizing legislation so that these tariffs can continue to be imposed.
Coming up, Ecuador is looking at ways to help the U.S. prevent